divorced mom is laughed at for her $1 inheritance, publicly humiliated in front of the people who destroyed her marriage. But the next day, a lawyer drives her to a hidden estate worth nearly $20 million. The cruel family who mocked her has no idea what's coming. Because the dying woman who left that single dollar wasn't being cruel, she was setting a trap, a test to expose greed, a plan to reward kindness, and 5 secret witnesses who've been watching for years. Now a vicious attorney will try to take everything. A daughter's medical crisis could break her, and the truth will either vindicate her completely or destroy her in court. Who were the 5 witnesses? What did the dying woman see that no one else did? And can one woman's quiet dignity survive when the powerful decide she doesn't deserve what she's been given? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and old rain, and Sarah Mitchell stood just outside its shadow for a moment before she made herself go in. She was still wearing her gas station name tag. She hadn't noticed until the elevator doors showed her own reflection. Sarah, the little red letters, slightly crooked because the pin had never sat quite right. She peeled it off and tucked it in her coat pocket. Not because she was ashamed of it, because today already required enough explaining. Emma walked beside her, holding her hand without being asked. 10 years old and already reading rooms before she entered them. She was wearing her church jacket, the navy one with the cuffs that were starting to ride up her wrists. "Mom," Emma said, as the elevator hummed upward. "Can we get McDonald's after?" Sarah squeezed her hand. "We'll see, Bug." Her checking account had $43 in it. She'd lost half a day's wages to be here, all because Margaret Ashford, her ex-husband Robert's elderly aunt, had apparently left her something. The letter from Cross and Bennett Law had been carefully vague. She'd almost thrown it away. The office waiting room was all leather and pale wood, and the particular silence that money buys. Derek was already there, standing near the window in a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car. His wife Amber sat beside him, a quilted Chanel bag set on the chair next to her like a second person claiming space. They both looked up when Sarah entered. Derek's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of expression. Amber's eyes moved from Sarah's coat to her shoes, to Emma's too small jacket, and a small smile crossed her face that had nothing warm in it at all. Attorney Martin Cross was silver-haired and deliberate, the kind of man who'd spent decades behind mahogany desks, watching people receive news they weren't ready for. He cleared his throat twice. Margaret Ashford, age 76, deceased. The estate to be distributed as follows. Derek received $1.2 million. Amber reached over and touched his arm before Cross finished the sentence. Amber received $50,000 in jewelry. 3 charities received bequests. Cross paused, and in that pause, Sarah felt Emma's hand tighten around hers. "And to Sarah Mitchell," Cross said, his voice flattening slightly, "I leave $1. The room erupted. Derek's laugh came from deep in his chest. "Even she knew," he said, gesturing toward Sarah without quite looking at her. "Even my aunt knew exactly what you were worth." Amber made a sound that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite sympathy, and was somehow worse than either. "Oh, honey, you really thought—" Sarah didn't hear the rest. She was watching Martin Cross slide a single dollar bill across the mahogany table toward her. His lips were pressed together in something between discomfort and amusement. Not his best moment. He'd know that later. She picked it up, folded it once, put it in the same pocket as her name tag. She signed where Cross indicated. Her handwriting was steady. It always was. "Thank you for your time," she said, and she took Emma's hand and left. She made it to the parking garage before Emma started to cry. The quiet kind. The kind she'd learned to do without calling attention to herself. They sat in the car for a moment, the engine ticking, Portland gray through the windows. "Why were they so mean?" Emma asked. Sarah turned, so they were facing each other. Sometimes people are cruel because they're afraid of their own smallness. They make other people feel small so they don't have to look at themselves. We don't get small back, we stay kind. Emma wiped her face with her sleeve. Nodded. She was 10 years old and she accepted this answer because she'd seen it lived before. Not just said. They skipped McDonald's. Sarah put $8 of gas in the car instead, watching the numbers on the pump the way she always did. That night at the graveyard shift, she taped the dollar to her register. Maria asked about it, and Sarah said reminder, and Maria, who knew when not to ask more, just nodded. The shift ended at 6 a.m. Sarah drove home, made Emma breakfast, helped her find her science homework, and sat down on the couch to close her eyes for 90 minutes before the alarm went off again. At 8:23, her phone rang. Cross and Bennett Law, the screen said. She almost didn't answer. His voice was different. Martin Cross had spoken at the will reading, with the measured, faintly bored authority of a man performing a routine. This was not that voice. This voice was quick, slightly uneven. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's been a development. I need you to come to the estate. I'm sending a car." The estate. She looked around her apartment, Emma's backpack by the door, the couch where she'd slept 40 minutes ago. What estate? "I'll explain everything when you arrive, please. This is important." The Lincoln Town car appeared at her curb 50 minutes later. She watched the city give way to highway, highway give way to coastline, the Atlantic gray and enormous through the passenger window. 3 hours north, the car turned down a private road marked only by a stone pillar, wound through spruce and birch for nearly a mile, and then the tree line broke. The mansion appeared like a fact that had been true all along without her knowing. Victorian. 4 stories of white clapboard and dark shutters, and a wraparound porch looking out over 12 acres of lawn rolling down to the Atlantic. Sarah pressed her palm flat against the cold car window without realizing she'd done it. Cross was waiting on the porch steps. He looked like he hadn't slept. He led her through the front door, wide plank floors, ocean light through tall windows, the smell of old wood and salt air, and into a library. Books floor to ceiling, a leather reading chair, a fireplace with a photograph on the mantel. Margaret Ashford, maybe 70, standing on that porch in a wool cardigan, looking at the camera with the direct gaze Sarah remembered from hospital visits. Stern, kind, both at once. Cross set a folder on the table and remained standing. "What you witnessed yesterday was a public document. What I'm about to show you is a private one." She read the words Ashford Family Trust, established April 2019, sole beneficiary, Sarah Ellen Mitchell, before her brain quite processed their meaning. In 2019, Margaret removed the bulk of her assets from her estate and placed them into a private irrevocable trust. The public will was her word, not mine. Theater. He paused. This estate. 12 acres, the mansion, everything. Valued at approximately $8.5 million. Additionally, $6.2 million in liquid funds. $4.8 million in investments. Total trust assets of approximately $19.5 million. He met her eyes. "All of it, Mrs. Mitchell, is yours." The fire made a small sound. Outside, a gull called over the water. Sarah sat down in the leather chair because her legs decided, without consulting her, that they were done. She'd brought groceries. She'd read books aloud. She'd shown up every Tuesday for 14 months because an old woman was sick and alone, and no one should be sick and alone. That was all it had been. That was everything it had been. "The dollar," she said slowly. "It was a test." Margaret wanted to ensure that if certain family members were inclined toward cruelty, they would demonstrate it on record, before witnesses, before it could be denied. He set a sealed envelope on the table. "There's a letter. She asked that you read it alone. 12 pages, cream stationery, Margaret's handwriting in blue ink." Sarah read every word twice. Margaret had watched her during those hospital visits. Not just accepted her help, watched her, the way she spoke to the nurses, the books she chose, the Tuesday reliability, when no one expected her, and she came anyway. The trust had been established the same month. Sarah's divorce was finalized. She read, "You're going to face a fight. Derek and his wife will not accept this quietly. They'll call it manipulation, exploitation, everything except what it was, which was me, choosing who I wanted to trust with what I built. I've made provisions for that fight. But Sarah, I need you to understand something about yourself. You don't quit. Not when things are impossible. Not when people are watching. Not when no one is. That's why I chose you." The letter's final page carried a warning. 5 observers had been positioned in her life. They would testify when the time came. The trust would be frozen during litigation. She could live here, but the money wouldn't be accessible until it was over. I know what you have. I believe that's enough. I believe you're enough. You always were. Sarah folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest. Then she stood at the window in this enormous, impossible, hers library, and looked out at the water, to let herself feel just briefly the full weight of being seen. She drove back to Portland, picked Emma up, and drove north again, Emma asking questions from the back seat that Sarah answered in pieces. By the time the mansion appeared at the end of the road, Emma had gone quiet in the particular way she did when she was feeling something too large for words. Sarah made them both tea in the estate kitchen, enormous and old and smelling of cast iron and wood. They carried their mugs to the library, and Sarah told her what she could. Margaret Ashford had never had children of her own. She'd had a daughter once, Eleanor, who died at 19 in a car accident in 1987. After Eleanor, Margaret had poured what should have gone to a child into her work, her causes, the modest but genuine generosity she extended to people who earned her trust. Robert had been her favorite for many years. Then she watched what he did to Sarah, and she revised her understanding of who he was. I watched you come to me that first Tuesday with grocery bags and no reason, the letter said. Robert had already told you not to bother. I know because I asked him not to tell you that. I wanted to see what you'd do without encouragement. You came anyway. You came for 14 months. You sat with me while I was frightened, and you did not pretend I wasn't frightened, which was the kindest thing anyone did for me in 2 years. The 5 observers. Sarah had not known she was being watched. She had not performed for anyone. She had simply been herself, the self that showed up to work when she was exhausted, that gave tip money to the regular who always looked hungry, that tutored kids after school because they needed help, and she had the time. She'd lived her life in obscurity, doing small things because small things were what she had to give. Worth is not what others see. The letter read, it's what you do when no one's watching. You have spent your whole life doing the right thing with no audience. I am making you an audience of one, just me and the record I've left behind to say I saw you. Sarah lowered the letter. Emma had fallen asleep in the leather chair, her tea half finished, sneakers still on. She looked very small in that enormous chair. Brown ponytail, hazel eyes closed, lips slightly parted the way they'd been since she was a baby. Sarah gently unlaced Emma's sneakers and set them on the floor. Bug, wake up a little. We need to go find our room. Emma's eyes opened halfway. Where are we? Home, Sarah said, and felt the strangeness of the word, and said it again. This is our home now. Something impossible just happened. We're going to sleep here, in this big impossible house, and it's going to be all right. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a child who has learned that all right is not a given. Are we still going to be us? Sarah pulled her gently upright and tucked her under her arm. Always. They found a bedroom on the 2nd floor with an ocean view and made it theirs for the night. Sarah lay awake long after Emma's breathing steadied, thinking about the 5 observers she couldn't identify yet. About what it meant to have spent 42 years being seen by exactly no one, and then discover that someone, all along, had been paying attention. At 11:47, her phone lit up the dark. Notifications, texts, news alerts. Someone had talked. The first headline read, Local woman inherits 19M bell. Family cries foul. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. The fight was beginning. The phone was still buzzing when Sarah woke up. 43 notifications before 7 in the morning. 3 voicemails from Derek, the first controlled and cold, the second less controlled, the third not controlled at all. She deleted all 3 without finishing them. At 7:15, the process server arrived at the front gate. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table with a butter knife. Derek Ashford and Amber Ashford vs. Sarah Ellen Mitchell. Claims of undue influence, fraud, elder abuse, affidavits from a nurse, a neighbor, a former housekeeper, people who had apparently witnessed behavior that Sarah didn't recognize as anything she'd done because she hadn't. Martin Cross called at 9. The trust is frozen during litigation. You can remain on the property, but the funds are inaccessible until the case resolves. A pause. There's an attorney representing the plaintiffs. Victor Gaines. He's very good. She'd already looked him up. Yale Law. 19 years in estate litigation. A track record the Portland Press Herald once described as a pattern of surgical dismemberment of inheritance cases. Her income was $1,740 a month. She had a frozen trust and a Victorian mansion and $43 in her checking account and a daughter who needed dinner tonight and lunch tomorrow. She could do this. She had to do this. Emma came home from school with red eyes and a tight jaw. They're saying we stole it. They're saying you made a sick old woman give you her house. Sarah sat down on the floor, eye level. What do you know about that? That it's not true. Right. So what do we do with things that aren't true? Emma thought about it. Keep going? Keep going. That evening, Victor Gaines appeared on the local news in a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car. We will prove that Sarah Mitchell positioned herself in the life of a vulnerable cancer patient, cultivated dependence, and exploited that relationship for financial gain. Margaret Ashford deserved better. Her family deserves justice, and we will make sure they get it. Sarah watched from the library. Emma asleep upstairs, the television the only light in the room. Let them come, she said, quietly, to no one. She turned off the television and went to check on Emma. She didn't hear the bathroom door close in the night. She didn't know anything was wrong until she heard the sound, a small, sharp cry, the kind that cuts right through every barrier between a mother and her child. She was in the hallway before she was fully awake. Emma was on the bathroom floor, pale, trembling with a fine motor tremor that looked like cold but wasn't. Her lips were dry. She'd been sick and was embarrassed about it, and frightened about being embarrassed, and those two things together had made her stay on the floor instead of calling out. Sarah thought about the last 3 weeks. The water bottle Emma kept refilling, the trips to the bathroom in the night, the tiredness that wasn't school tired or staying up late tired. She thought about those things for about 4 seconds. Then she picked Emma up and carried her to the car. Dr. Sarah Kwan delivered the news plainly, the way someone does when they've done it enough times to have found the right words. Emma has type 1 diabetes. Her blood sugar on admission was 487, normal range is 70 to 140. She's been symptomatic for probably 3 to 4 weeks. This is a lifelong condition. It will require daily management. Sarah sat very still, hands folded in her lap. In Emma's case, we'd strongly recommend an insulin pump. It's more precise, better outcomes for kids her age, better quality of life. Dr. Kwan set down her tablet. The pump itself is about $8,000 up front. With your insurance, out-of-pocket annual costs will run approximately $12,000. The number sat on the table between them. $12,000 a year. The trust was frozen. Her income was $1,740 a month. She had $43 in her checking account. Okay, Sarah said, steady, because the alternative wasn't available to her. On the third day, Robert appeared in the doorway. She hadn't called him. He looked older than she remembered. Thinner, cheaper shoes, the careful posture of someone arriving somewhere they weren't sure they'd be welcomed. I heard about Emma. He stayed in the doorway. Can I come in? Emma was asleep. Sarah stepped back and let him in. He sat across the bed and looked at his daughter with an expression that had no performance in it at all. Just a man reckoning with something. The business failed, he said eventually. Jessica left. He paused. I have $3,000 saved. I want to put it toward Emma's pump. 5 years ago, I walked away from the best thing I ever had. I can't fix that, but maybe I can do one decent thing. He met her eyes. Please. She let out a long breath. All right. Emma was discharged on a Thursday with a $4,200 hospital bill and a diagnosis she'd carry for the rest of her life. On the drive back, she stared out the window at the coastline and said, very quietly, "Are we going to lose the house because of me?" Sarah's chest pulled tight. "Nothing matters more than you." Emma nodded and went back to watching the water. Sarah gripped the wheel and drove, her mind already moving, already calculating, already looking for the answer, because there had to be one. There was always one. The estate kitchen had been empty since the day they'd moved in. Every time she walked past it, she saw only the waste of it. The commercial range, the walk-in refrigerator, the 6 burners that could all run at once. And people were hungry. She'd known people who were hungry for years. The answer had been sitting right there all along. She woke at 5 in the morning and made herself a decision before the coffee was finished. The master bedroom was wrong. She'd known it since the first night. The largest room in the mansion, original plaster ceilings, a 4-poster bed she and Emma had stood in the doorway of without going in. It felt like wearing someone else's clothes. The carriage house was behind the main building, 800 square feet, 2 small bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that Emma had already declared her favorite thing in the world. Staff quarters once. It felt like a home. She moved them that morning. By noon, their clothes were in the small closets, and Emma's books were on the windowsill, and the carriage house smelled like their laundry soap. Martin Cross came by that afternoon and went through the numbers with the careful expression of a man who already knows what he's about to say isn't good. Her income, $1,740 a month. Her expenses, $2,745, including the old apartment lease, Emma's medical costs, the hospital payment plan, food and gas, and the 100 small things that make up a life. -$1,000 and $5 every month. There's also a settlement offer. He set a piece of paper on the table. $200,000, full release of claim. She looked at it. $200,000. She could pay Emma's medical costs for years. She could breathe. She thought about Emma on the bathroom floor. She thought about Margaret's letter in her coat pocket. She thought about the parking garage. We don't get small. No, she said. Sarah, if I take that, I'm telling Emma that bullies win. That when things get hard enough, you take the easy way and call it practical. She shook her head once. No, he didn't argue. She thought he'd expected that answer. She broke the apartment lease that day. $1,900 penalty, but it eliminated $950 in monthly rent. New math, -$55 a month. Survivable. Barely, but survivable. That left the kitchen. She called Father Miguel that evening. She'd known him 3 years. Volunteered at his soup kitchen every other Saturday, washing trays and learning the names of the regulars. He picked up on the second ring. I have a commercial kitchen nobody's using, and people are hungry, she said, so I'm going to cook. A pause. Then Saturday? Saturday. They served 87 meals that first Saturday. Homeless veterans, elderly neighbors, 2 families she recognized from the gas station. She didn't announce it. She didn't take pictures. She just cooked. Father Miguel organized, Emma helped set tables, and at the end of the day the pots were empty and the kitchen smelled like the best thing any of them had done in a long time. Victor filed an emergency motion the following week, claiming the kitchen program constituted improper use of estate resources. The local news covered it. They interviewed a homeless veteran named Carl, who looked straight into the camera with the careful dignity of a man who'd learned to be careful about where he put his trust. She treated me like a human being, he said. That's all. She just treated me like a human being. A week after the segment aired, a card arrived with a $100 bill inside and a handwritten note. Keep going. Over the following weeks, more came. Small envelopes, small amounts. By the end of the month, $1,200 had accumulated in a new credit union account. She used it for groceries for the kitchen and kept cooking. 8 weeks after Emma's diagnosis, her blood sugar crashed during a Tuesday night dinner. She sat down suddenly, hand on the table, eyes not quite focused. Sarah caught her. She sat on the kitchen floor with her daughter in her arms and pressed her face into Emma's hair and made herself breathe slowly. She had to solve this. She had to solve it now. What she did next, no one who loved her would have let her do if they'd known. But they didn't know, because she didn't tell anyone. She made 4 phone calls before sunrise. She was tired, so tired. The kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and spreads into your hands. The kind that 4 hours of sleep doesn't touch, because 4 hours of sleep isn't sleep. It's just a pause between one kind of exhaustion and another. The 4 calls before sunrise had each asked for something she hated asking for. Maria at the gas station said yes before Sarah finished explaining, the way Maria always did. 2 other coworkers said yes with the careful generosity of people who didn't have much to give but gave it anyway. The 4th call was to the tax preparer about her refund timeline. By the end of the week, she had a plan that required a 4th job, 10 p.m. to 2 in the morning, 4 nights a week, commercial office cleaning, downtown Portland, $14 an hour. She waited until Emma was asleep, drove the 40 minutes into the city, cleaned 7 floors of a law firm, and was back by 3, alarm at 7. She did this for 6 weeks. She lost 15 pounds. She didn't have to lose. Her hands, already cracked from gas station chemicals and kitchen soap, split at the knuckles, and she kept bandages in her coat pocket. She stopped tasting food, not because she wasn't eating, but because her body had stopped having opinions about anything except the minimum required to keep moving. Martin Cross saw her at a pretrial hearing in early March and went still in the conference room doorway for just a moment, long enough for her to know what she looked like through other eyes. He set a paper on the table. $25,000, Victor's latest offer. Her eyes were so tired the digits blurred before she blinked them into focus. "No," she said. "Sarah, no." He picked it up without arguing. She drove home and found Emma awake at 2:30 in the morning, sitting on the kitchen floor with her glucose monitor in her hand and her knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes were red. "I know we can't afford the pump," Emma said. "I know that's why you're gone at night. It's because of me." Sarah sat down beside her on the floor. She didn't say that's not true. It was true, in all the ways that mattered least, and none of the ways that mattered most. "Look at me," she said. Emma looked. "You are not a problem I'm solving. You are the reason I do everything. There's a difference." Emma leaned into her, and Sarah held on, her cracked knuckles pressing gently into her daughter's hair, until Emma's breathing slowed and she fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder. Robert came the following week with an envelope, $3,000 in cash, the kind of saving that requires going without things you're used to having. "5 years ago, I walked away from everything that mattered," he said from the carriage house door. "I lost it all. Then I ended up in the hospital, and you paid the bill, $8,000. You were fighting this lawsuit and working 3 jobs, and you paid my hospital bill." He shook his head. "I'm trying to be decent for the first time in my life. Please let me." She took the envelope. The final number came together on a Tuesday. Robert's $3,000. Co-worker loans, $2,000. Tax refund, $1,800. The small donated envelopes, $1,200. $8,000. Exactly, as if it had been arranged. Emma got the pump installed on a gray March Thursday. When they walked out of the clinic, she lifted her shirt slightly, looked at the device clipped to her waistband, said nothing for a moment. Then she nodded, the way she did when she'd made her peace with something. Dr. Helena Chen was waiting in the corridor. She'd been Emma's attending on and off since the diagnosis. Quiet, observant, the kind of doctor who asked questions that weren't quite clinical. She fell into step beside Sarah. "You turned down $250,000 while working 4 jobs and managing a sick child's care," she said. "Most people wouldn't do that. It takes very specific character." "I told my daughter that bullies don't win," Sarah said. "I had to mean it." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, as if that answer had confirmed something she'd already suspected. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. Trial date, April 15th, 6 weeks. Victor's witness list was 23 names long. Martin's had 1 name besides the trustees, himself, and the truth. She had no idea that help had been quietly on its way all along. She'd been serving meal 387 when she first noticed them, not because they looked out of place. The Saturday meal line drew all kinds. But these 4 moved with a deliberateness that was different from hunger. They were watching her, not unkindly, carefully, the way people watch something they're in the process of deciding about. When she looked up fully, they were gone. 2 days later, Martin Cross called her to the library. "The 5 trustees Margaret positioned have formally requested a character evaluation meeting, April 1st, 2 weeks before trial." "What does that mean?" "They need to vote collectively on whether your conduct since learning about the trust meets Margaret's standard. A unanimous vote activates the poison pill clause. He paused. If even one votes against you, the forfeiture provision doesn't engage. Derek and Amber could win and face no financial consequence at all. She held very still. All this time. The meal program, the settlement refusals, the 4 jobs. They've been watching, Cross said. Yes, that was always the arrangement. She drove home and sat in the carriage house kitchen for a long time. Not panicking, but reckoning with the specific terror of having tried her honest best and not knowing whether it was enough. April 1st arrived gray and cold. 5 people walked into the library, and Sarah looked at them one by one and understood for the first time the shape of the net Margaret had quietly built beneath her. Dr. Helena Chen, Emma's attending physician, who had asked slightly too personal questions and nodded at answers like she was confirming something already written. Father Miguel, 3 years of Saturday mornings, never once letting on. She understood now why he'd answered her call about the kitchen so quickly. Jackson Webb, her employer of 6 years at the gas station, compact and deliberate, with a way of noticing things without appearing to. She thought about every Tuesday she'd given her tip money to the regular, who always looked hungry, not knowing her boss was 3 feet away watching through the office window. Patricia Yee, Emma's principal with the flower-decorated reading glasses, who had watched 5 years of school pickups and free tutoring and parent-teacher evenings where Sarah stayed after to stack chairs. And then Robert. He met her eyes and didn't look away, which was more than she'd expected. She saw in his face the exact weight of what he was carrying. Margaret called me 6 months before she died, he said. She said she was leaving everything to you. She said you were the person she'd hoped I'd become. He looked down at his hands. Then I lost everything. I ended up in the hospital and you paid my bill. That's when I finally understood what she meant. Jackson Webb spoke first about his hesitation, the meal program, the estate resources, active litigation. He'd worried it showed impulsive judgment. But then I watched her cook, he said. She wasn't trying to prove something. She was just feeding people because they were hungry. That's all it's ever been with her. The vote was unanimous. Dr. Chen spoke for all of them. You've passed every test, most without knowing you were being tested. When Derek and Amber proceed to trial, the forfeiture clause will be ready to activate. She looked at Sarah steadily. You're going to win. Sarah sat with that for a moment. Not triumphant, just deeply, quietly grateful that Margaret Ashford had seen her clearly enough to build something this careful around her. She didn't know that Victor Gaines had spent those same 2 weeks preparing 23 witnesses for the most methodical character assassination Portland's courts had seen in years. She would find out in 14 days. April 15th arrived with cold sunshine and a parking lot full of news vans. Sarah had been up since 4. She'd made Emma breakfast, read Margaret's letter one more time, the part that said you don't quit, and put on the navy dress she'd bought at Target in 2019 for $32. She's the one she'd worn to job interviews and school concerts and every occasion that asked for something better than a gas station uniform. The hem was slightly frayed. She didn't have another one. She walked into the courtroom and felt it before she saw it clearly. The specific density of a room full of people waiting for a reckoning. Victor Gaines was already at the plaintiff's table in a suit that cost more than Sarah's car payment. Weightless and absolute, the armor of a man who'd never had to think about what things cost. His cologne arrived before he did. He was making notes without looking up, which she understood was a performance. Everything he did in this room would be a performance. That was his gift. Derek sat behind the bar in a charcoal suit, jaw set, performing confidence for a jury that hadn't filed in yet. Amber beside him in a cream blazer. Chanel bag set on the seat like a territorial marker. She glanced at Sarah once. Her eyes moved from the $32 dress to the scuffed sneakers without pausing. Judge Catherine Morrison took the bench at 9 sharp, silver-haired, in her 60s, with the economy of movement of someone who had run courtrooms long enough to have no patience for theater. Victor stood. For 40 minutes he constructed a version of Sarah Mitchell that Sarah herself barely recognized. A predator, calculated, patient. He painted the 2017-2018 hospital visits not as kindness, but as positioning, a woman from a failing marriage who had identified a wealthy elderly cancer patient and embedded herself until Margaret Ashford, weakened and frightened, could no longer distinguish genuine affection from strategic cultivation. He had charts, a timeline, the crisp, confident certainty that sounds like truth when it has been rehearsed enough times to lose all its seams. Sarah kept her hands folded on the table and her face still. Martin Cross stood when Victor sat down and said, simply, that Margaret Ashford was one of the most strategically intelligent women he had known in 30 years of estate law, that she had not been manipulated, that she had deliberately and precisely engineered both the public humiliation and the private provision to ensure the people who deserved her estate received it, and the people who didn't would expose themselves trying to take it. 5 credible witnesses had watched Sarah Mitchell for years without her knowledge and would testify to what they'd seen. He sat down. Victor's witnesses came in the afternoon. Carla Simmons, a fired nurse who testified Sarah had pressured Margaret in private. Her details were specific, and she glanced at Derek once too many times. Martin cross-examined her for 18 minutes until she was contradicting her own affidavit in front of the jury. She stepped down looking smaller than she'd arrived. Thomas Brennan, a neighbor, testified about unusual visits. Martin asked him to describe the house layout, the street orientation, the windows he'd allegedly seen through. Thomas Brennan got the street wrong. He was excused. Dr. Westfield, an expert psychologist, testified about elderly patients' vulnerability to undue influence. Martin asked when he had first met Margaret Ashford. He had not. Martin thanked him and sat down. Derek took the stand in the late afternoon, and he was good. The fishing trips that had been fictional, the phone calls he hadn't made, the grief that sat exactly correctly on his handsome face. Several jurors leaned forward. Then Martin stood. Mr. Ashford, in the last 10 years, how many times did you visit your aunt? Derek's jaw shifted. Several times. We had a close... You called her 4 times in 10 years. Each call between 3 and 7 minutes. You visited twice, both within 30 days of her estate attorney updating her will. He looked at Derek steadily. And the week of her funeral, where were you? 2 seconds of silence. There were scheduling conflicts. You were in Cancun. I have the hotel reservation. Martin looked at the jury. Your close relationship was fiction, wasn't it, Mr. Ashford? Derek's composure didn't shatter, but it cracked. A hairline fracture around his eyes and the corners of his mouth. The smallest evidence of a man who had spent 38 years believing performance was good enough to substitute for the real thing. Court adjourned at 5. Sarah walked to her car with Martin beside her, cold April air carrying the smell of the harbor 3 blocks away. Tomorrow, Martin said quietly, cross-examination. Trust me. She looked at him, this man who had slid $1 across a mahogany table. A lot had changed since then. All right, she said. She drove home. The carriage house was quiet. She sat in Margaret's leather chair with the letter in her lap, and didn't read it, just held it. Let the weight of it be enough. Tomorrow, everything would change. She had no idea yet how completely... Derek was still on the stand when court resumed. He'd spent the night being coached back into composure. The hairline crack from yesterday sealed over. The grieving nephew expression reset. He looked steady, polished. Amber sat behind him in a pale gray blazer, hands folded, her face arranged into the practiced expression of a woman who had rehearsed looking wronged. Martin Cross let him sit there for a long moment before he stood. The cross-examination was quiet, relentless. Martin didn't raise his voice once. He asked questions that had no good answers. Waited, asked the next one, and the jury watched Derek's careful story develop fissures it couldn't survive. By the time Martin said no further questions, Derek walked back to his seat without looking at anyone. Amber took the stand after lunch. Her voice was warm and sad, the voice of a woman telling the truth reluctantly. She described a conversation at a family dinner in early 2018. Sarah leaning across the table, saying that old people were easy to manipulate if you acted like you cared. The jury went very still. Martin Cross stood slowly. Mrs. Ashford, you testified this conversation occurred at a family dinner in early 2018, correct? That's right. Robert Mitchell filed for divorce from Sarah Mitchell in March of 2018. According to his own filing, they separated 6 weeks prior, mid-January. He paused. Can you explain why Sarah Mitchell would attend an Ashford family dinner after separating from her husband? Amber's mouth opened, closed. Would you like to revise your testimony? She would not revise her testimony. She would not meet the jury's eyes either. Martin said, the defense calls Dr. Helena Chen. The courtroom shifted, the particular attention of a room that senses something important arriving. Dr. Chen had practiced pediatric medicine for 28 years. She described Emma's diagnosis, the financial reality Sarah had faced, the 4 jobs and the refused settlements and the insulin pump assembled from loans and tax refunds and small donations. She described a mother who never once made her daughter feel like a burden, who sat in hospital corridors after Emma was asleep and allowed herself to cry only when she was certain no one could see. In 28 years, Dr. Chen said, I have not witnessed more selfless parenting under more impossible circumstances. That is my professional and personal assessment. Victor's objection was overruled. Father Miguel came next. 3 years of Saturday mornings. Sarah arriving before the soup kitchen opened, learning the names of the regulars. The Tuesday in January she'd shown up with her own groceries because donations had run short, and she couldn't stand the thought of anyone going home hungry. He'd never once heard her mention the lawsuit. He'd never once seen her act for an audience. Jackson Webb testified in the careful, economical way of a man who chose his words like tools, only what was necessary. 6 years of watching, the tip money given away, the co-workers' shifts covered without being asked, the customer who came in every Thursday morning, always a few cents short, and how Sarah had quietly covered the difference every single time for 2 years without ever making the man feel it. She treated people like they mattered, Jackson said, because to her, they did. Patricia Yee described 5 years of school pickups, free tutoring, and one afternoon when she'd found Sarah in an empty hallway, quietly fixing a broken reading display no one had asked her to fix, because some of the younger kids had started ignoring it, and she thought it deserved better. The courtroom was very quiet. Then Martin said, the defense calls Robert Mitchell. The silence became something else entirely. Robert walked to the stand with the careful humility of a man who knew exactly what his presence here cost him, and had chosen to pay it anyway. He sat down. He looked at the jury. He did not look at Derek. He told them about Margaret's phone call, the words she'd used. He told them about his own fall, the business, the second wife, the hospital, and the bill he'd received afterward with a note in Sarah's handwriting that said simply, "Get well, $8,000. From a woman fighting a lawsuit, working 4 jobs, managing a sick child's care. Sarah Mitchell is the best person I have ever known," he said, his voice steady with the effort of keeping it steady. "She was kind to me when I gave her every reason not to be. She was kind to Margaret when no one else was." He looked at the jury one by one. "Derek and I don't deserve a penny of that trust. Sarah deserves all of it. Every single cent. Margaret knew that. Now you do too." The room held the weight of that for a long moment. Victor had come into this trial with 23 witnesses. Martin had demolished every one. Victor had built a careful architecture of suggestion and innuendo, and the 5 observers had walked in and dismantled it, board by board with nothing but the truth. For the first time in years, something that might have been doubt showed on Victor Gaines's face. Tomorrow was closing arguments, and after that the jury would decide everything. The courtroom was even more packed on day 4. People who hadn't been there before, faces Sarah didn't recognize. Standing along the back wall, the homeless veteran who'd been interviewed on the news was there. A row of women from the Saturday meal program, who had dressed carefully for the occasion. She sat at the defense table in her $32 Target dress and felt for the first time in months something loosened slightly in her chest. Victor gave his closing argument first. He was too good a lawyer not to recognize when a strategy had failed. He pivoted cleanly, abandoned the predator narrative, shifted to pure legal principle, the burden of proof, the standard for undue influence, the responsibility of the court to protect vulnerable elderly individuals. He spoke for 40 minutes and was precise and measured and completely without the theatrical certainty of his opening day. He knew. He just couldn't show it. Martin Cross stood and spoke for 22 minutes. He said Margaret Ashford had been many things: private, exacting, occasionally imperious in the way of women who have learned to move through the world without help. But she had never been foolish. She had been the most strategically intelligent client Martin had represented in 30 years. The evidence of that intelligence was sitting in a library 3 hours north of this courthouse, embedded in a document that had anticipated this exact trial and prepared for it with more care than most people gave anything. He said Sarah Mitchell had not positioned herself. She had simply shown up, for 14 months on Tuesdays, with groceries and library books, and the radical ordinariness of a person who believed a sick old woman deserved company. She had not known about the trust. She had not asked for anything. She had simply been who she was, in the dark, with no audience, and Margaret had decided that was exactly the kind of person worth everything she had built. He pointed at the 5 observers in the gallery. 5 people watched this woman for years. A doctor, a priest, an employer, a school principal, and the ex-husband who had every reason to say otherwise. They all said the same thing, because there was only one thing to say. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Sarah sat in the hallway with Martin Cross beside her, and a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. She thought about the dollar bill taped to her register, Margaret's letter worn soft at the folds, Emma on the kitchen floor at 2:30 in the morning, 87 meals on a Saturday, the 4:30 alarm and the cracked knuckles, and the $32 dress. She thought about what it meant to have been seen. The door opened. The jury foreman stood in the jury box and read from the paper in his hands in a clear, unhurried voice. Find for the defendant, Sarah Mitchell. No undue influence, no fraud, no elder abuse. The gallery erupted. Sarah sat very still for one full breath. Not the money, not yet. The verdict on the thing that had actually been on trial since the moment she'd walked into that law office with Emma's hand in hers. Her character, her worth, Margaret's judgment of her. Vindicated. Judge Morrison let the gallery settle, then turned to Derek and Amber. The forfeiture clause embedded in the Ashford family trust has been triggered. The $1.2 million distribution to Derek Ashford is hereby voided. The $50,000 jewelry bequest to Amber Ashford is hereby voided. Per the trust instrument, these assets transfer immediately to Portland Homeless Services and the Hospital Pediatric Diabetes Fund. She paused. This court affirms Sarah Mitchell as sole beneficiary of the Ashford Family Trust. Case dismissed. Derek's face went white. Not flushed, white. The white of a man watching something he'd believed was permanent become nothing in a single sentence. Amber pressed her hand to her mouth. She did not pick up the Chanel bag when she stood to leave. Victor Gaines gathered his papers with the careful economy of a man performing composure because it was all he had left. Outside, the cameras were waiting. Sarah stood at the top of the courthouse steps in the April sunlight and said what was true, not what would sound right. Margaret Ashford taught me something. She taught me that kindness is never wasted, and that cruelty always costs more than the people who commit it think it will. She looked directly into the camera. That's all. That evening, she drove home alone. Emma was asleep on the carriage house couch, Robert dozing in the chair across from her, the television on low. She stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them. Then she went to the library. She took the dollar bill from her coat pocket, still folded once, the same fold she'd made in that law office 9 months ago, and wrote on the cardstock backing of a small frame, "Worth is not what others see. It's what you do when no one's watching." She hung it on the library wall where the morning light from the ocean windows would catch it first. Then she sat in the leather chair, in the quiet and the dark, and slept more deeply than she had in months. 6 months later, the mansion was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. October light came through the tall windows, warmer, more amber, the kind that made everything it touched look like it had always belonged there. The library shelves still held Margaret's books, but now also binders with names on the spines, case files, program records, grant applications. The parlor had become an intake office with 2 desks and a box of children's books in the corner for the kids who came with their parents. The commercial kitchen ran 6 days a week. The Margaret Ashford Foundation had been a 501c3 for 4 months. Sarah had hired 5 people: Marcus Webb, Jackson's nephew, fresh from the bar exam and willing to work for a salary that wouldn't impress his law school classmates because the work itself was the kind that mattered. Maria Santos from the gas station, who had loaned Sarah money for Emma's pump and now ran intake coordination with the competence of a person who understood exactly what the families walking through the door were carrying. The diabetes program had moved fastest. 127 children had received free insulin pumps in the first 4 months. 127 families who no longer had to choose. 127 kids who could be kids. Emma volunteered every Saturday in the library, converted to a youth room, sitting with newly diagnosed children and their terrified parents, her own pump visible on her hip. She had her mother's hazel eyes and considerably more of her own confidence, and she had discovered that there was almost nothing more powerful than being able to tell a frightened child, "I know exactly how this feels, and it gets easier." Robert had been coming to the foundation Thursday nights for 2 months, teaching the financial literacy workshop Marcus had built. He was not the same man who had driven away 5 years ago. Thinner, quieter, more likely to listen than to fill a room. After the 6-month celebration, he found Sarah in the hallway. "I want to keep volunteering, if that's all right. We run financial literacy Thursday nights," she said. "If you're serious, talk to Marcus." His eyes went bright. He blinked it back. "Thank you for not giving up on me." She thought about several things she could have said. She decided instead to simply nod, the way Margaret had once nodded at her, acknowledging something real without dressing it in more words than it required. There was still unfinished business. Derek and Amber and Victor Gaines had each met consequences the celebration hadn't yet addressed. The reckoning that had begun with a single dollar bill slid across a mahogany table was not entirely complete, and Sarah was about to find out exactly how far it had reached. The Maine State Bar Association hearing room was smaller than a courtroom but felt heavier. Victor Gaines sat at the respondents' table in June 2025 in the same kind of suit he'd always worn, impeccably tailored, the armor he couldn't remove even here. His silver hair was still perfect, but his hands folded on the table were absolutely still in the way of a man working very hard to make them be still. The evidence left very little room. Recorded calls coaching Carla Simmons on details she couldn't have known herself. Emails to Amber with suggested testimony language, including the fabricated dinner conversation Martin had dismantled in 3 minutes of improper media contact during active litigation. A $5,000 wire transfer to a paid witness routed through a shell company. 2-year suspension, $50,000 fine, 40 hours mandatory ethics training, public censor. His name, the findings, published in full on the Bar Association's website, where any client who searched for him would find it first. Victor received the decision with his face completely composed. He thanked the panel. He walked out into the June sunshine and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before he made himself move. He had won so many cases. He had convinced himself over 23 years that winning was the same thing as justice. He had built a career on that belief, and a reputation on that career, and a self-image on that reputation. The self-image was the last thing to go. It went in that hearing room. He would reopen a small practice after the suspension ended and take quieter cases. 5 years later, an anonymous $25,000 donation would arrive at the foundation with a Boston postmark and no note. Some reckonings happen publicly. Some happen in the silence between who a person was and who they decide to become. Derek's happened more visibly. The $1.2 million transferred to charity within 72 hours of the verdict. His apartment lease collapsed. He sold the Rolex in July for $9,400, which covered 2 months of a modest apartment near Bayside. He lost his position at the financial services firm in August. The trial coverage, the Cancun detail surfacing in open court, the public censure of his attorney, none of it was something a firm could quietly absorb. He found work as a financial advisor at a mid-size firm in South Portland, $68,000 a year, a third of what he'd made before. He drove a 2019 Civic and wore suits from Target and ate lunch at his desk. He thought about his aunt, about what it would have meant to simply show up, to bring groceries, to read aloud to someone who was frightened and alone. He thought about how those things had cost Sarah Mitchell nothing but time and had cost him everything. In July, he drove 3 hours north. He sat in his Civic at the foundation's front gate for nearly 10 minutes before he made himself get out. Marcus Webb answered the door, assessed him with Jackson's eyes, and considerably less patience than Jackson would have used. Sarah was in the intake office. She looked at Derek Ashford, thinner, cheaper haircut, the Rolex long gone, wearing a Target dress shirt she recognized by the label from her own shopping, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, something quieter and more complicated than either. She let him speak. He said what he'd done, plainly without the performance of remorse she would have recognized from across a room. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for it. Character isn't who you were, she said. It's who you choose to become. She paused. We run financial literacy Thursday nights. If you're serious, talk to Marcus. He was serious. He showed up the following Thursday with lesson materials he'd prepared himself and taught 9 people how to read a credit report, understand an interest rate, build a budget from scratch. He was patient. He was clear. He was, for the first time in anyone's memory, including his own, genuinely useful to people who had less than he did. He volunteered for 12 weeks, then 12 more. Amber never came. But in September, an envelope arrived with no return address. A cashier's check for $5. Marcus ran the handwriting against the foundation's files and found a match to intake paperwork filled out under a different name 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Sarah simply deposited the check and logged it under anonymous donations and let the woman keep her silence, which was the most generous thing she could think to give her. Some people change in public. Some people change where no one can see. Both kinds count. April 2026. 1 year after the verdict. The mansion was lit from every window. Sarah stood at the top of the porch steps, watching the last cars arrive for the foundation's first annual gala, and she thought about the night she'd stood outside this same building for the first time, pressing her palm flat against a cold car window, unable to quite believe what she was seeing. A year was a long time. A year was nothing at all. 150 guests filled the rooms that had once held only old furniture and silence. Donors and volunteers and families the foundation had served, moving through the parlor and the library, and out onto the wraparound porch, where the April air carried the first real warmth of the season, and the Atlantic glittered in the last of the daylight. The testimonials came after dinner. Maria Rodriguez stood at the front of the room, in the blazer she'd bought with her first paycheck from the medical assistant program. She spoke about arriving at the foundation's door, with a bruise on her jaw, and $17, and the specific terror of not knowing what happened next. About what it meant to have someone look at her and see not a problem to manage, but a person with a future worth investing in. Her voice broke once. She let it break and kept going, the way Sarah had taught her without meaning to, just by example. James Chen's mother talked about her son, pump number 43, now 11 years old, who had told his soccer coach last fall that he wanted to be a doctor someday so he could help kids like him. The room laughed softly. The good kind of laugh, the kind that comes from recognizing something true. Keisha Williams, who had arrived with 2 garbage bags of belongings and a paralegal certificate earned online at 2 a.m. for 3 years while working retail, said the foundation had given her the bridge between what she'd built and what she could become. She had her own apartment now. She was not the sum of her worst year. Dr. Helena Chen took the microphone and said that 6 other states had now launched foundations modeled on the Ashford structure. Combined, they had served more than 600 families and put insulin pumps on more than 400 children in the past year alone. What Margaret Ashford had started in a private library with a 12-page letter and a single dollar bill had become something no one person could contain anymore. It had become a movement, quiet and steady, spreading the way good things spread when they are built on something real. Sarah listened from the back of the room. She had gotten better at receiving things without deflecting them. Emma stood beside her, the insulin pump visible on her hip, decorated with small stickers of sea creatures she'd chosen herself. Martin Cross found her during the break. He'd been different since the trial, the platinum cufflinks in his pocket more often than on his wrists, the performed authority gone. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not just for the dollar, for the way I saw you, for the years I spent assuming I could read a person's worth from the outside. Margaret chose better than I did. I'm still learning from it." She nodded. "We all are." Robert came to her near the end of the evening. He crossed the room to Emma first, the way he always did now. Emma, then Sarah, the right order, the order that said he understood what he'd missed and was still trying to earn back. He and Emma stood together by the porch windows looking out at the water, and Sarah watched her daughter laugh at something her father said, and the laugh was real and unguarded and entirely Emma's own. Later, Sarah took the microphone. She was not a natural public speaker. She never would be. But she had learned that her voice, the quiet one, the steady one, the one that didn't perform anything, was exactly the right voice for what she needed to say. "Margaret Ashford never met most of you," she said. "She never saw this room, or knew these names, or understood exactly what she was setting in motion. When she sat alone in this library and decided that one woman's kindness was worth everything she had built." She paused. "She just knew that worth is not what others see. It's what you do when no one's watching. It's who you become when life tries to break you. It's the choice you make over and over to stay kind when cruelty would be so much easier." She looked out at the room, at Maria in her first paycheck blazer, at Emma by the window, at Robert with his Timex watch and his calloused hands, at the 5 people who had watched without her knowing and testified to what they'd found. "Keep seeing people the way Margaret saw me," she said, "for who they are, not what they have, not what they've lost, who they are." The applause started slowly and built into something that filled every room of the mansion and went out through the open porch doors and across the dark lawn toward the water. Sarah stood at the porch railing afterward, Emma at her side, the April air cold and clean off the Atlantic. Below on the beach, 2 children from a housing family were running along the waterline in the dark, their laughter carrying up through the salt air in small, bright pieces. She thought about Margaret sitting in this house alone in 2019, with a pen and 12 pages of cream stationery and the absolute conviction that one woman's character was worth betting everything on. She thought about a folded dollar bill in a coat pocket. She thought about Tuesday mornings with grocery bags and tip money given away and chairs stacked in empty hallways, all the small, unwitnessed things that had seemed to disappear into the ordinary air of an ordinary life, and had in fact been accumulating, invisibly, into something larger than she could have imagined from where she'd stood. Kindness compounds. It always has. Margaret had just been the first person to show her the math. Emma leaned into her shoulder. "They want one more thing." Sarah turned back to the warm light of the house. She took Emma's hands, and they walked back through the porch door together, into the room full of people whose lives had been changed by the belief that no one is worth nothing, that every person who walks through a door carrying everything they have left deserves to be seen clearly and helped honestly and told the truth. The dollar bill hung in its frame near the entrance, catching the chandelier light. Worth is not what others see. It's what you do when no one's watching. Margaret Ashford had lived by those words in obscurity, had died by them in certainty, and had left them to a woman who had earned them the only way they can be earned, one ordinary, unwitnessed act of grace at a time. And now they belonged to everyone who read them on the way in. They always had.